Good afternoon, first year. I hope you're all having a lovely Tuesday. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be in class today. We're going to have to do our lesson this way instead. So what you are going to need to make sure you've got ready is your Planet Earth booklet and something to write with. And your cover teacher, whoever they are, will just need to be ready to pause this video every so often when you've got some work to do. So last week we were having a little look at how we would go about sampling animals and plants in an environment, and we were talking about quadrats, and we were talking about pitfall traps and putters and sweep nets and tree beating. Now I know we didn't quite get that finished off. We were still hoping to go outside and use our quadrats, and fingers crossed we'll get a chance to do that next week when I'm back in class. And for today, we're just going to skip ahead a little bit and carry out this lesson, which is all about identification keys. So this one is going to help you understand how biologists are able to identify different organisms. So by the end of the lesson, we would expect that you would be able to identify species using a branching key or a paired statement key, and that you would be able to draw your own branching key or paired statement key. And I'll explain exactly what both of those are and how you might be able to do that. So why might we want to be able to do this? Well, if we have been doing our sampling, let's say we've been out, we've been getting our pitfall traps, we've been using our quadrats, we need to be able to identify the species of organism that we have collected. And we're going to do that by using an identification key, just a method of being able to figure out what species it is, usually by answering some pretty simple questions. So here's a very simple example of what we would call a branching key, and it's called a branching key because it's got lots of branches on it. So depending on the type of organism you had, you would have a wee look at all of the different questions, working your way down the list until you got to the correct answer. So if we had, for example, a fish and we're just trying to identify what type of vertebrate it is, we're not even interested in what type of fish it is at the moment. We would go through the questions. So does it have fur? No, a fish does not have fur. Does it have feathers? No, it does not have feathers. Does it have dry skin? No, it doesn't. Does it have scales? Yes, it does. And that takes us to fish. So a very simple key like this helps you identify the type of organism that you've got. And that's going to get a bit more specific and a bit more complicated when you have animals that are more closely related and are more similar than the ones that we have got in this key here. So if we had been out with our pitfall traps and we had collected some organisms, we would want to try and identify them. So you might already know what some of these organisms are, but we'll take them one by one and have a wee look at exactly how this branching key would work. So each statement has got either a yes or no, and depending on your answer, that's going to take you down a little different branch till we get our identification. If we start with this first organism here, has the animal got legs? Yes, it does. Does it have any wings? No, it does not. Has it more than 8 legs? Now, you can't quite see that in the picture, but yes, it does, which means we've identified that one as our woodlouse. Moving on to our next organism then. Again, just working our way through the questions. Has the animal got legs? No, it doesn't. Has it got a shell? Yes, it does. So we've identified that one as our snail. Our third organism, this one here, has it got legs? Yes, it does. Has it got wings? Yes, it does. Are the antennae feathered? No, they're not, which means this one is identified as our butterfly. Our fourth organism, this one here, again, we're going to go back to, has the animal got legs? No, it doesn't. Has it got a shell? No, it doesn't. That takes us to our worm. Our next one, this one here, again, has it got legs? Yes, it does. Has it got wings? Yes, it does. Are the antennae feathered? Yes, they are. So that leads us to our moth. Now, that would leave this one to be our spider, but let's double check it anyway. Has the animal got legs? Yes, it does. Has it got wings? No. Has it got more than 8 legs? No, it doesn't. It's got 8 exactly. So that one identifies that one as our spider. So using a branching key really just lets you work your way through the different identifying features of whatever species it is that you have in order to figure out the actual identity of each one. So this is your turn now. You need to flip to page 10 of your booklets where you have a copy of our cow identification key and our dinosaur identification key. So you need to be able to work your way through the key and identify what type of cow is cow 1, what type of cow is cow 2, and then what type of dinosaur is dinosaur 1 and what type of dinosaur is dinosaur 2. So I'll let you pause the video and have a wee look at carrying that out. So hopefully you've worked your way through both of those. So we'll have a quick look at the answers. If we look at cow 1, is the body more than one colour? Yes, it is. Does the animal have a black or a white face? It's got a black face, so therefore it's a Russian black pied. Taking our second cow, is the body more than one colour? No, it doesn't. Does the body have long or short hair? It's got long hair, so therefore it's a Highland cow. So cow 1 is a Russian black pied and cow 2 is our Highland cow. So correct those in your booklets for me just now. And then when we look at our dinosaur 1, you should have had dinosaur 1. Does it have a long neck? Yes, it does. Are its front legs longer than its back legs? No, they're shorter, so it's a Gallimimus. And our next one, does it have a long neck? No, it doesn't. Does it have triangular plates on its body? No, it's a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So using your keys to identify different organisms is fairly straightforward when you're following these questions. What we need to do now is have a look at making our own branching key and figuring out the process by which you would do that. So we're going to start off with some Mr. Men. Mr. Clumsy, Mr. Forgetful, Mr. Fussy, Mr. Happy, Mr. Impossible, Mr. Strong, Mr. Grumpy and Mr. Noisy. And we're going to try and figure out a branching key to be able to identify the different Mr. Men. So the first thing we're going to look at is what criteria would split them into two even groups. So in what ways can we make two groups different from each other? As you look at them, you might spot a few different things. I'm going to go through the ones that I have chosen, but just so you know, there's no really right or wrong way of writing a branching key. As long as your criteria, your questions, split them up into the correct groups and you can identify them all correctly at the end. So we're going to look at the criteria that I've got just now, just because I'm not there to hear your answers. So if we look at these guys, what criteria would split them into two even groups? Well, if we look at these ones, are they wearing a hat would be my first question. So this 4 up here have all got no hat on. The 4 down here have all got a hat on. So we're then going to start with just one of these groups. We'll split them into two groups of 4 and we're just primarily going to look at one group first of all before we deal with the second group. So if we've got our start, we've got wearing a hat and not wearing a hat. Taking the guys who are wearing our hats first, these guys. So how are we going to split them up into different groups? So we need to start separating these guys out a little bit. I would go for round or square. So we have 2 that are round, 2 that are square. If we then split them up, we've got round or square, so we'll take our round guys first. We've got Mr. Impossible and Mr. Forgetful. So they're quite similar. How can we distinguish them from each other? We've initially separated your groups out by those wearing a hat, those not wearing a hat, those which are round versus those which are square. We now need to sort of separate our 2 round Mr. Men from each other. I'm going to go with colour of hat. So Mr. Impossible has blue hat, Mr. Forgetful has a red hat. So if we add that into our branching key, red hat versus blue hat gives you our separation and lets you identify Mr. Forgetful from Mr. Impossible. However, we've still got quite a few Mr. Men to identify and we've still got some gaps in our key. So let's go back to our square Mr. Men, which are wearing a hat. So we're going to fill in this one first of all. So we need to figure out a way of identifying Mr. Strong versus Mr. Grumpy. And unhelpfully, they've both got the same colour of hat this time. So we're going to have to come up with another way of splitting them up. How could we distinguish between the two of them then? Well, smiling and not smiling. So if we use our criteria of smiling to it, we can add those in. We've got smiling, we've got not smiling, and we've got Mr. Strong and Mr. Grumpy separated. So that has been half of our branching key completed. We've gone with our start process. We've split them into two groups, those wearing a hat and those not wearing a hat. Dealing with our hat wearers first, we have split them into round ones or square ones, and then our round Mr. Men we have separated by the colour of their hats, whether it's red or blue, and our square Mr. Men we have separated based on whether they're smiling or not smiling. So we then need to move on and finish off the other half of our branching key. So we need to think about the Mr. Men who are not wearing a hat, which is everybody else. Mr. Clumsy, Mr. Fussy, Mr. Noisy and Mr. Happy. So how could we split them into two particular groups? Well, I've gone with hair or no hair. So we've got some with hair and some without hair. So if we have a wee look at going back to our key, not wearing a hat, it comes down to hair or no hair. And then if we have a look at the ones with hair, first of all, we've got Mr. Clumsy or Mr. Fussy. Now, how are we going to distinguish between those two? They're actually very similar looking. However, we could say we've got messy hair or neat hair. So if we're going to split them up, our guys wearing with hair, messy hair is Mr. Clumsy and neat hair is Mr. Fussy. So we'll then deal with our Mr. Men with no hair. How can we distinguish between these two, Mr. Noisy and Mr. Happy? Shoes and no shoes. They're both round, although they're slightly different colours, they're both smiling. So let's say Mr. Noisy is wearing shoes, Mr. Happy is not. So if we take them back onto our branching key, they were the ones which were not wearing a hat and didn't have any hair, so they're over here. We've got shoes versus no shoes gives us Mr. Noisy and Mr. Happy. So if you were to take one of these individuals, let's say Mr. Grumpy, and you were to look at him and work your way through the branching key. Let's see, is he wearing a hat? Yes, he is. Is he round or is he square? He's square. Is he smiling or not smiling? He's not smiling. It's Mr. Grumpy. And that's how you know your branching key has worked. If you have a little look at the Mr. Men that you have or the organism that you've tried to identify and create your branching key for, you can work your way through it and make sure it makes sense. You can also, if you've done one, swap it with a partner and see if they're able to check and assess it for you. So what I would like you to try and do now is take maybe 5 minutes and try and create a branching key to identify these aliens. And once you've done it, if the person sitting next to you is finished as well, you can maybe get them to try it for you, or you could pick one of your aliens and see if the branching key that you've done makes sense. So this is my solution to how you might want to identify your aliens with a branching key. Now yours might look a little bit different to this. You might have selected different questions in different places, as really you could have separated them in 3 different ways, whether or not they've got wings, whether or not they've got antenna, and whether or not they have arms. So it would really have depended on where you put which question. So don't worry if you've got them in a slightly different order, as long as you have 2 main branches to your branching key, starting with one big question at the top and then separating out into 2 branches on either side. So as you can see, I started with, does the alien have wings? And if we went with no, then I decided to separate them by antenna. So does the alien have antenna? Yes, it's Glenn, and no, it's Edward. On the yes side, I decided to separate them by whether or not they had arms. So if that was a yes, it was Chris, and if it was a no, it was Kate. So it would actually have been absolutely reasonable for you to start with, does the alien have arms, and separate them out that way, or does the alien have antenna, and separate them out that way. So it really does depend on which one you decided to pick first of all. There is no right or wrong or definite answer when it comes to a branching key, as long as you have the main processes, as long as you've got one question with a yes or no answer, and then a secondary question with yes or no answers, which are splitting up your 2 groups. Moving on to our other type of key. This one is what we refer to as a paired statement key. And what we're looking at in this one is very similar to a branching key, only in this case we have statements which are based in pairs, and depending on your answers to each question, you're going to have to go to a second question. So if we look at this example here, we're looking at this leaf, so we're looking at what tree is this leaf from. So question 1 is, does it have needles? You would go to question number 2, and if it doesn't have any needles, you would go to question number 3. So looking at our leaf, there are no needles present on that one, so we would go to question 3. Question 3 is, if the leaves have spines, it's a holly leaf, and if the leaves have no spines, it's an oak leaf. So we can identify that this is an oak leaf based on the 2 questions that we've needed to answer. So a paired statement key is very similar to a branching key, it's just organised in a slightly different way. You're still separating out your organisms according to different key criteria. So what I'd like you guys to do is have a wee look at page 11 of your booklet. You've got a paired statement key there, and you need to be able to try and identify these 5 organisms based on what is in that particular paired statement key. So reading through each statement for each organism and trying to figure out which one is which. Again, you shouldn't need very long for this, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. So if you've had a look at that one, we'll have a very quick look at the answers. A, you should have been able to identify as a spider. B, you should have been able to identify as a beetle. C, you should have been able to identify that as a housefly. D is of course a woodlouse, and E is a millipede. So I'll quickly correct those in your booklet just now. Make sure you've understood the stages of using a paired statement key. So now you've identified some organisms using a paired statement key, it's going to be your turn to try to write one. So this diagram is also on page 12 of your booklet. You're going to try and write a paired statement key to identify these organisms. So it works very similarly to how we did the branching key. All you need to do is figure out how are you going to split your organisms up into 2 even groups, and then how are you able to identify the different organisms that are within those groups. So there's a few different options that you can see there, a few different ways in which they are variable from each other. So really, again, it's going to depend on your choices. This one might take you a little bit longer to write paired statement key for, so maybe take about 10 minutes to try and do this. If you do get it finished, remember to double check it, make sure all the answers and questions that you've put make sense, and again, you could ask your partner or the person around you to have a quick look at it and see if they can test it for you, see if it makes sense. So having a look at my example, again, you might have separated them by different criteria. You might have put different questions in different orders. We also did have to give our organisms some names. I've come up with the most alien-like names I could possibly think of. So I decided to separate mine out, first of all, based on whether or not they had eyes or whether they had no eyes. So my individuals with eyes are these 3 here. So then trying to separate out these 3, I decided to go with who has a long neck versus who has a short neck. So very quickly, the person with the short neck is this one here, who I've named Ruku, and those with a long neck, we can't identify them quite yet. They need to go to question 3. I'm going down to question 3, and to split the pair of them up, I've gone with how many feet they have. So 2 feet is Merkel, and 4 feet is this guy Swift. So that then has identified these 3. So we need to go back to our others. Now I'm now on question 4, so has no eyes, go to 4. And again, I've decided to go with long and short necks to begin with. So those with a long neck, it's go to question 5. If it's got a short neck, it's ARP. And then separating out those that had a long neck, we have Bob and Gleb. Again, I've decided to separate them out by their feet. So if they've got 2 feet, that's Bob. And if they've 4 feet, that is Gleb. Now, again, your paired statement key might look a little bit different to that. You might have put them in slightly different orders. You might have started with has a long neck or has a short neck, or your first question might have been has got 2 feet or has got 4 feet. And again, I'm going to guess you've given them slightly different names to the ones that I chose. But what you're looking to correct is making sure that you've got roughly 5 statements and that they're paired up in a way that has made sense to you. I will obviously be having a wee look at these when I am back in next week, and will correct anything that you've not quite understood, though I'm sure that you have done excellently as ever first year. So I hope by now you have been able to identify your species using branching and paired statement keys, and that you've been able to draw a branching or a paired statement key. Now, drawing them is a little bit more tricky, so if you've not quite grasped that, don't worry about it just now. We will have a wee look at them again when I'm back in next week, after we've had a chance to get out and do our sampling. Please get in touch via Google Classroom if there's anything you're not sure about, if there's anything you're worried about. And can you also make sure to get in touch if you did have anything you wanted printed off for your research leaflets next week. So if you're not sure how to do that, and you can't get onto Google Classroom, just leave a little note with the cover teacher just now, and I'll make sure to get in touch with you when I'm back in school over the next couple of days. Thanks very much, first year. I'm sure you've worked very hard, and I look forward to seeing some of your answers when I'm back in school shortly.